All right, thank you all so much for joining us after lunch here in track 2 of the GUR virtual summer camp. We are about to get started in a talk from Daniel Smith called The Development and Validation of a Heuristic Checklist for Virtual Reality Game Design. The chat is open, and if you have questions, please post them in the Q&A function within Zoom. We have our moderator, Garrison, here, is going to be kind of fielding questions and taking notes of them, and then we're going to be, he's going to let the panelists know during the talk as things come up, if there's a chance that you want answered right away, and there might be time at the end as well. This talk is going till 2 o'clock. So whenever you are ready, Daniel, you can go ahead and get started.
And I appreciate you, and I want to thank everybody for coming to this talk. Today, you've already heard the title. I'm not going to read it to you, but I'm going to be giving a talk on my dissertation topic, a little bit about me, because I don't have a slide for this. I am a PhD student at Wichita State University in the Human Factor Psychology program. I just completed my 4th year, and my dissertation is on creating a checklist for virtual reality game design that looks at how we can improve the usability of VR. We're going to talk a lot about, some of the literature on this stuff, what immersive design in VR, like where it stands right now. What is a heuristic evaluation? Why does this research matter? And what am I doing? How am I gonna make this better? Because there's a couple things already out there. So how am I going to improve upon what's already out there? So the first thing we should talk about is VR games in general, or just VR. So VR is a growing market right now. It's pretty small. VR gaming compared to traditional gaming is still pretty small, but it is growing. And some of the reasons why we think it is currently small is not because people don't like it. It's not because people aren't interested in it. It's more because it's not as affordable as it could be. It's kind of gaudy, a lot of it, which we'll talk about what I mean a little bit later. And so people are investing in it if they are they're super excited. They're very interested in this technology, so they're willing to invest a lot of money. Because up until recently, when the Oculus Quest came out, you needed a full-blown gaming PC, and which was upwards of $1,200 at the time. And the HTC Vive was $800. The Oculus Rift was $600 or $700. And until recently, it hasn't been very affordable. People don't want to drop $2,000 on something that isn't that they're only going to use for one thing. But it is on the rise. It's getting cheaper. It's getting easier to run, and it's becoming smaller. And we're kind of learning what we can do with games and with the hardware to get people to adopt it. And it's a growing market. Because it's so young and such a small user base, the way that we design it it's not terribly systematic yet. We've got a little bit of research out there on how we design good VR games, but it's still a new science. The past 5 years is when we've really gotten into it. We've really got an actual user base, because there's VR research from the 90s, but it's like no one was using this stuff. So how do we really do research on it? And there's just not that many principles like we have for traditional games. There's all these lists and all this research and these concepts and theories about here's how we do motivation, here's how we get people engaged, things like that. And it's just not out there for VR. However, there are those principles which are applied to games, and there are some principles that are applied to VR worlds, not necessarily VR games. And so it's kind of out there. It's just split, and it needs to be brought together. So why do we need to do this? Well, one of the biggest reasons is that VR brings unique characteristics to gaming. Traditional games don't have a lot of the pieces that VR brings to the table, such as total visual immersion. This is a headset that's on your face, so you can't see anything else. It's like you're actually present in the world. You can physically interact with things. You reach out and you grab it, and you swing a sword around, and you pull the trigger, and you actually do all these things instead of just using a controller and pressing buttons to do them. We found that people tend to embody their avatars more deeply than in traditional games, because it's physically you. It's an egocentric view of the world. And so they tend to see this character as being themselves, which plays on your emotions. I'm making this moral decision, and it's harder for me to make this decision because I'm actually doing this. I'm actually, going to assassinate this person, or I'm actually going to steal this gold, or something like that. And then finally, physical activity. Like there's a game called The Thrill of the Fight where you're actually like, you're boxing and you're actually punching. And I'm a big fitness person, and I played that game and it made me tired. Beat Saber has you swinging your arms around and things like that. This is new to gamers. Gamers are used to sitting there like this with a controller in their hand and playing, or playing with a mouse and keyboard. So these are things that we haven't researched yet. We don't understand because we haven't had this. This hasn't been a thing we had to consider when designing games in the past. And there are some things out there. There's usability studies. There's VR Play, which was created by Dr. Deservire from User Behavioristics, which I've been using in my research. There's one called Oxygen that's kind of great literature. And then there's all kinds of other research that's out there that's targeting like this slice of VR research. And when we're looking at the bigger picture, it needs to all be together. Because if I'm a UX researcher and I'm looking at a game and I'm like, I want to look at the usability of this or do research on the user experience, I don't want to have to go through 40 different papers to build the whole puzzle. It would make it much more convenient for me if I could just say, okay, what are some concepts and like what are the concepts that I need to be looking out for in good VR design? And it's all in one paper, all in one section compiled like the way that I need it. One way that you can find this is a heuristic evaluation. So a heuristic evaluation is where a UX expert or a usability expert will take a list of good design concepts and evaluate something. So evaluate some kind of system. So the ones you can see here, this is Nielsen's 10, which is kind of the original group. Well, it was 9, but then he came back and he added another one, and it became Nielsen's 10, which is what can be applied to pretty much any system, including games. So you go through like a game, and you would say, okay, how well is it meeting all of these design concepts, and where do our problems lie, and let's figure out a way to improve it. And I'll talk about exactly how that method works a little bit later, but that's the gist of how this works. And this is a general one. This is one that applies to everything. But with that comes the problem of, okay, how detailed are we getting? This is where domain-specific heuristic evaluations come in. There was a study in 2016 that looked at something like 300 different heuristic lists, broke it down into around 80 that were domain-specific, and then tried to see, okay, are these finding more serious problems, more domain-specific problems, like a problem might be related specifically to a video game versus just some software. And they found that, yes, it is better. Whenever you target it towards something, it's not applicable to everything like Nielsen's 10, but it does find more and more effectively reveal these problems in whatever you're evaluating. And these lists exist for virtual reality, not necessarily to VR games. VR Play is for virtual reality games, but there are a bunch of them that are out there for notifications and VR worlds and like regular games, and even maybe for flow in games or flow in the real world, or just all these different things like hardware as well. These exist, but like I said, these are just pieces that are scattered throughout the literature, and we need to get them together. So the idea that I am implementing for my dissertation is to do exactly that. It's to take all of this previous literature that's related to VR games, but not necessarily specifically on VR games, or is not looking at a big picture. It's looking at one individual thing, combine it all into one comprehensive list that will help UX researchers evaluate a VR game to see, is it usable? Is it meeting all the expectations, which will hopefully lead to immersion and presence, which I'll talk about exactly how it's going to do that a little bit later. So now that you know what I'm doing, let's talk a little bit about like, what is this based on? So it's a list, great, and it will probably have some useful stuff in it, but what is it trying to achieve? And what kind of information am I using in order to make sure that that everything that I do in this is trying to reach a goal of gaming? And that's where literature review comes in, which we all love. We're all researchers, we love literature reviews. So what's the point of games? What do we mean by immersive design? The goal, and we know the goal of gaming is to be fun a lot of the time. Obviously there are exceptions, but gaming is supposed to be fun. Generally when we develop a game, we're like, all right, I want people to play this and get wrapped up in it. I want them to really enjoy it. I want them to be engaged. I want them to have fun, and then want to come back and play it again. And we've come up with all these ways that we can do that in traditional games. But VR has now opened up these opportunities that we've never had before. And we can make it fun in a brand new way. Like Thrill of the Fight, you can like shadow box, but it's actually giving you something to hit. Or in Beat Saber, you can flail around. For those of us that don't know how to dance, we can flail around to music, and it still has a purpose. Like, it's something that we really enjoy doing. And when we give them all of this, the goal is to get them lost in the game. That's what we want to do. And we can take each of these avenues in various ways to make sure we are reaching that immersive design. And now I've said this a bunch of times. I've said like immersive design. We want them to be lost in the game, want them to be immersed. But what do we mean by that? And there are three concepts that I use to describe this: immersion, flow, and presence. So immersion refers to, in this case, a lot of people use immersion and presence as interchangeable, but I wanted to go deeper than that. And so for the sake of this, and what the literature says, is immersion is hardware. So this is your display technology. This is basically saying you need something that is going to encase the user. So like a VR headset that covers up the eyes. And we'll go into more detail on the next slide on what that means. Presence refers to the psychological state that you think of whenever you hear the word immersion. It's where you're present in the world. You feel like you're not in this physical realm that you're actually in, that your body is actually in. You feel like you are in the virtual world. You're in the game, and you are the character that you're playing. And then flow is a term coined for just everyday tasks, where it's considered the optimal experience, where you're at a high performance level, you're really engaged, your attention's taken up, and you are 100% focused on this. You experience things like time distortion, and I know you guys you probably have it in your head like, oh, I've played this game before, and that's what I experienced. Like 15 minutes go by, and it's 2 hours later. And when you experience things like this, you're probably engaging in flow. And these are the three concepts that this list is based around. Each individual piece, each check that you're gonna tick off whenever you're using this list is meant to contribute to at least one of these in some way. But in order to understand like how we're gonna do that, we should go a little bit deeper into what each of these mean. So the first is immersion. As I said, this is hardware. This is display technology. This is the headset and the controllers and things like that. And this is saying that what the literature says is, in order to be immersive, hardware has to meet 4 criteria. 1, it has to be inclusive. This means that it has to exclude all external stimuli. So when you're wearing a headset, you can't see anything. When you're wearing headphones, you can't hear anything else that's not coming from the headphone. You can't see anything that's not coming from the headset. It also needs to be extensive, which means it needs to cover up as many of your senses as it can. So in this case, we focus on ears and eyes. We want to make sure your vision is completely taken up and your auditory is completely taken up. You can move into tactile, which would contribute to this, but our technology is not really there yet, and maybe your sense of smell, but that would kind of be weird. So we're going to stick to audio and visual. 3, it needs to be surrounding, which means it needs to be like a 360-degree experience. In the real world, it's not all just coming from in front of you, which is a problem that we face with traditional games, like this monitor that I have in front of me and the speakers that I have in front of me. There's not going to be sound coming from behind me, but in the game, there should be. And so this makes it more panoramic. And in VR, we have that opportunity. People can actually turn around and look behind them and see that things are going on. And then it needs to be vivid. So it needs to have a high resolution, because the real world has a high resolution. It doesn't have to be, 8K or anything like that, but it needs to be high enough that we don't notice individual pixels and things like that. Because if we do, it makes it painfully obvious that it's a virtual experience and it's not the real world. It just needs to be high enough that we can kind of forget about that. And if any of you have ever used like the DK2 or the DK1, you probably know what I'm talking about. I think this is called the screen door effect, where it looks like you're looking through a screen door. And if you have this, people are not going to get immersed. So for presence, we're trying to give them the experience of, I'm in this world. I exist within this virtual world. It's a state of consciousness that you can experience when engaging with a virtual world, whether that be in VR or in a traditional role, such as on a TV or on a monitor. And this really focuses around attention. Our attention being scattered to the real world inside the game and also to the real world will break this. So our goal is to grab their attention somehow. Whether that be we're giving them a difficult, or not necessarily difficult, but a challenging task. This will keep their focus on what they're doing. And if what they're doing is just in the virtual world, then their attention won't be in the outside world. And once you've grabbed that attention and you hold on to it, people will experience presence. So our goal is to give them a task, give them a world that is captivating, that is going to make sure they always have something they can attend to. They always have something that they're doing that keeps them. We want to keep them here. Don't let them wander. It's like students that their mind wanders because we're not keeping them engaged. Same thing with gamers. We want to make sure we keep them in the room, or in this case, in the virtual world. Then the last concept we talked about was flow. So this is the optimal experience. You have high performance, you're being challenged, but you're able to meet that challenge, and you get to something called the flow channel. So this is where your skill and your challenge are kind of balancing themselves out. In the beginning, they're going to be low skill. So you want to challenge them just a little bit. And then as they start to learn, you start to ramp up the challenge and they get better at it. You have to challenge them more. They continue to get better, and you just keep following it all the way up, as you can see right here in the lower right. And if they engage in this, if you can get them into this flow channel, then they will be experiencing your game in a really positive way, in an optimal way, as coined by the author. And so our goal is to make sure we are balancing that difficulty. And there are various other things that we'll talk about a little later that help you meet this flow channel. What we don't want to do is give them too much or too little challenge. If we're giving them too much, they're going to get frustrated. You can see all of the options up here. They can get anxious. They start to worry that they can't play this game. They're not good enough. And this is not a good experience. And I don't know if you've ever played a game that you just felt completely incompetent because you couldn't beat it, Dark Souls. But it's so frustrating. And sometimes you're like, screw this. Like, I don't want to play this anymore. I'm done. And if you challenge them too little, they get bored. Like, we play a game where we're like, okay, I'm walking around like I'm killing these enemies in one hit. This is too easy. I'm not interested in this. They won't feel a drive to come back to your game and continue to play. So like, that was boring. I'd rather play a game that was fun, that I enjoyed. And this concept was not originally brought up for games. It was brought up for just everyday tasks that take up your attention, that are challenging things that people have to overcome every day. But it has been applied to games and coined as game flow, where we can directly associate all 8 requirements for flow to game concepts. We see a very direct connection. And the experience that you have of time distortion, like you forget that all this time is going by, is so easily related. We've all experienced it before. So this is very easy to map over to video games. So these are the 3 concepts: immersion, presence, and flow. And just a quick recap, because we talked a lot. Immersion is hardware. Make sure you have like something covering your eyes, covering your ears. Presence is the state that you want them to reach, where they feel like they're present inside the world. And then flow is where you're challenging the player enough that they have to focus their attention so they become immersed in the game, but you're not challenging them so much that they get irritated or they get frustrated. And these are what this list is meant to achieve. This list is going to try to get to all 3 of these states for VR games. But now that we know what they are, how do we actually get there? How do we actually reach that immersion state where you are in that world? You have completely lost sight. You don't even think about your job. You're not thinking about the outside world. You're not thinking about anything else. You're just there in the game. There's a couple theories that have come up to try to suggest how we do this. The first one actually doesn't even have a name. It's just the paper's just called Grounded Theory and Immersion. So I didn't try to give it a name. That's just what I'm going to call it. There are 3 stages, according to this theory, to reaching that state that we want to put them in. There's engagement, engrossment, and total immersion. And what you have to do is overcome these barriers. Barriers are like this locked gate I've got here in this screenshot. And once we get through those gates, we will reach that stage. And once you've reached a certain stage, then a player is going to be engaging or have a certain relationship with your game. And you have to reach each individual stage before you can get to the next one. And the final one is total immersion, which is where we want our players to be. This is where they're enjoying our game. They're engaged with our game. They're going to come back. They've had that feeling of, I want to go play that game, like when they're doing something else. So how do we reach each one of these? The first one is engagement. So engagement is just when you're trying to get your player to invest time and effort into your game. Or if you want to frame it this way, invest money into your game. This is a world of free to play, which is difficult. It's difficult to actually get people engaged when they don't actually invest time and money, or when they don't invest money. I'm actually going to pause. It looks like we have a question.
Hi, we have a question from George Blanco. They say, given the definition of immersion presented, would this predict that stylistic, e.g. cel-shaded games would inherently be less immersive?
So I have to forgive me. When you say cel-shaded, what exactly does that mean? I'm not a game developer, so I'm not actually sure what that means. Cartoon. Okay, so not necessarily. I wouldn't say that. So the theory, if you take it at face value, I believe, yes, it would say something like that. But with this definition of immersion, it has to have a high resolution. Not necessarily does it need to be lifelike. So it should be appropriate. The way that I teach this in my psychology of video games course at a very basic level of games do not have to be realistic like Call of Duty or Battlefield or something like that, but they should be consistent. Whatever you're going to put in your game, don't put like silly, like this is hard to come up with on the spot, but silly sounds or something with a really realistic game. So don't make it look like Call of Duty and give it sounds like you find in Cuphead or something like that. As long as it's consistent and it's a high resolution, like it's clear, then you can still reach this level of immersion, I think. I don't think it's a matter of whenever I'll talk about high fidelity stuff a little later. When I say high fidelity, I don't necessarily mean consistent with the real world, but rather consistent with the world inside the game. Because the goal is to make them feel like they're in that world. And as long as you build it all in the same way, then they will feel like everything fits and they'll feel like this is a new world that they're present in. I have personally gotten immersed in Borderlands, as James has mentioned, Borderlands myself. And so maybe I'm biased because that's one of my favorite game series of all time, but that's how I feel about it. I've actually played VR games as well that were the cartoony style, and I've gotten lost in it because everything was the cartoony style, including myself, which just kind of made me change my self-image while I was playing that game, which made it very easy for me to get immersed in that game. If that makes sense. All right, so continuing on this, stage one is engagement. Like I said, the goal is just to invest time and effort. And the barriers to this are controls and interests. So is it usable? Can people play your game? Have you mapped your controls in a way that people just can't learn? Because if you've ever played a game where the controls are bad, you can't stick with it. It's so frustrating because you keep pressing the wrong button and it breaks it so bad because it's not natural. It doesn't feel like you can just naturally do things and focus on like, okay, I'm fighting this boss. Where's his weak point? What moves do I have to make? You're focused on, okay, what button do I press on the controller? Which is you focusing outside of the game, which is going to break your immersion. So bad control or good controls are essential for you to get to the stage. And then player interest. This seems like a really obvious one. If your player hates sports games, then you're not going to be able to get them to engage with an NBA 2K game. You have to give them something that they're interested in playing. So maybe some people are interested in a rich storyline. And if this game doesn't have one, they're not going to invest time in it. This one's pretty obvious, but it's probably the biggest barrier to reach this stage. But let's assume your game has great controls and people are interested in it. So then your goal is to reach the engrossment stage. So engrossment, they've already started playing your game. They like your game. They feel like they can play it, they can master it, and they can get through it. So now we start getting into some deeper connections, such as the plot. Like, are you engaging them in what's happening in the game? Do they care about it? At this point, new mechanics, like novel mechanics that you have created, are no longer fresh. They're not captivating the user anymore because they've been using it for a while. They're like 5 hours into the game already, so they're comfortable with it, and they're like, okay, this is cool now. Now I'm just using it all the time. So now you need something for them to look forward to. So is the plot good? Are they interested in what's going to happen? Are they emotionally excited by what's happening? Like, if it's something that's novel, that's a new kind of story, maybe you're actually playing the bad guy or something like that, they might be like, oh, I'm really interested to see, like, when I'm forced to make moral decisions, like, what's it going to do? Which leads me into the tasks section. So the tasks that you're having them do are also really important. Are they interesting? Or are you having them pick up the same resource for 50, get 50 of them, which take 5 seconds every time you bend down to pick it up to turn them in? Because this is not interesting. They'll do it 2 or 3 times and be like, okay, this sucks. This is just a waste of my time. So making sure that you're giving them tasks that are engaging and something that they're interested in and have to actually invest effort into is the way that you keep them engaged. You get them engrossed in it. It's taking their attention, which gets them a little bit closer to immersion. They're engrossed in it. So now they are both engaging with it, they're playing your game, and they're engrossed in it. They're focused on it. And it looks like we have another question.
Yes, this one is from Serkan Ayan. Don't you think that game mechanics can be part of engrossment? Maybe forcing players to react in a certain way could affect this stage.
So I think that it could. However, I think that it belongs to the first stage because mechanics are kind of that's the attention grabbing point. Whenever, like, I'll use Black Desert as an example. Black Desert says our combat is amazing. Our combat is so unique, and there's thousands of combos and abilities that you can use. So as soon as you get into the game, we're going to teach you how to fight. And so you're introducing these mechanics to try to interest them. And if they hate your mechanics, they're going to disengage with it. So if you can't get them past, let's say, the tutorial, then you haven't reached the engagement stage. And the tutorial is kind of where all the mechanics come up. I think if the context within the mechanic, within how you're using the mechanics come up and it's frustrating, like we say, okay, we're going to teach you how to do this crazy combat style. And then they put you in a fight where you like can't use it. If you do use it, you end up losing, or you have to use it in such a complicated way that you can't figure it out. I do think that it would affect this stage. However, I think that the bulk of the effect is going to be on the first stage because mechanics, at least so I use my example, not good as a researcher, but it keeps coming up. For me, mechanics are really important. And if you have really cool mechanics, that's what will get me to say, I don't know how I feel about this game, but I'm going to give it another shot because this is a cool mechanic. Because that's actually what happened to me with Black Desert. I loved the combat because it had so many different combinations, but I found myself using 1 or 2 the whole time. Storyline wasn't that interesting, and ultimately I played like 10 hours and then I quit. Just because once those mechanics kind of wore off, which they do, getting to this point, by the time you get here, they do, the freshness kind of wears off, then you need something that's more expansive to keep your attention. So I think it could affect this and contextually, but I think that overall it has more of an effect on the first stage. So now you know how to get to engrossment. Plot and task. Give them interesting tasks. Give them a plot they're interested in, so that they will continue to try to unravel it and see what's going to happen. So now you've got them engrossed in your game. They're focused. They want to see how it ends. They're obviously able to play because they got through the engagement stage. So now, how do you get them lost? How do you get them to that point where they don't even care about the real world? So this is the stage called total immersion. This is where they are inside your game. They feel like they are the character. And that's exactly what one of the first barriers is, character embodiment. Does the player feel like he or she is that character? Things like making meaningful decisions are really important here. whenever you give them like, here are your options that you can explore. A game that does this, an excellent job of this, is Fire Emblem Three Houses, the most recent one. Without giving any spoilers to anyone, you get to make massive decisions, and they will let you know, hey, this is a huge decision, and it's going to drastically affect your story. And it makes you feel like you have designed this journey that you're on. You feel like you are in control, and you're making these decisions for yourself. Your moral obligations and your own morality has been injected into this character because you're making meaningful decisions based on your own morality. So making sure they embody the character is a big hurdle for this. And the next is something similar, but with other people. So forming strong emotional bonds with other characters within the game. This also counts for the main character, but thinking about how we form bonds with people in our lives all the time. And can we make players form a bond with people in their party, or family members within the game, or people that live in the village that they're protecting, or whatever? If we can make them form those bonds, they feel an emotional connection, and they feel like, as that main character, they need to behave in a certain way. They need to play the game and save the town, protect your teammates, things like that. Whether that be, for example, a really good one is Tales of Symphonia. I think did a really good job. This was a GameCube game I played back when I was a kid, and the storyline is that you are protecting your teammate, who is this special character who needs to become an angel in order to save the world. And then she keeps getting sick and she keeps getting hurt, and you have to kind of save her and guide her through the entire game. And I found myself feeling emotional connection to that character, and when things would happen to her, I would get upset about it. And this got me kind of lost in the game because I felt like she was my friend, and this made me want to go play the game so that I could continue to interact with these characters. And if you can do all of this, your player's totally immersed. Congratulations, you did it. So these, and overcoming all of these barriers, are part of design. How do we design the game in order to overcome all of these barriers? So this is grounded theory and immersion. This is one theory for how this works. The next theory is called the immersion, presence, and performance model. So the IPP model looks to immerse a player or a user in order to increase their performance, and says that if we can fill out all of these steps, we will actually get them to perform better, which will cause them to allocate more attention, which will get them to perform better, and it just turns into a big loop. So this is a big old model right here. I'm going to split it and talk about each one for you guys in a little more detail. So this is the first half, and I'm going to cover this one a little bit quickly because we've kind of already talked about a lot of it. So you have to have an immersive display technology, as we've talked about. A head-mounted display, cave, which is like a bunch of screens all around you that will be actually projected in 3D so that you can interact inside of it, which is kind of also an AR version of it. Like, you still see the entire world. You can just see these 3D projections. And if you have that, you can get to the immersion part, making sure that the display technology meets all of those requirements that we talked about. Needs to cover up your eyes and ears, needs to give you a 360 experience, make sure it's from your perspective, like a first-person perspective, the egocentric representation, because doing third-person in VR is just really difficult. It's hard to get immersed in a game when it's not from your perspective. It's from the perspective of someone in front of you. And then matching is talking about it needs to be an accurate physical representation. So when you turn your head like this, it shouldn't turn more than you. Or when you move your hand up or down, it should move physically accurately, the way that you're moving your hand, and not more or less, because that's very game breaking. Then we get to sensory fidelity. And this is where we look at different sounds and sights and things like that that you can show. So this one has a lot of senses that are potential, but we're going to focus on spatial and auditory. This is where we're making sure things are moving and sounding the way that they should. This is the consistency thing from the question that we just talked about. Make sure if you are showing an explosion, make it explosion sound. Don't make it sound like a water dropping into a pool. That's not going to make any sense. That's going to be low fidelity sensory signals, and it's going to break immersion. So making sure that all of the stimuli that you're giving the player is consistent with whatever they're seeing or whatever they're looking at, that or whatever they're supposed to hear that keeps them engaged. It makes it feel like everything in the world is consistent as it is in the real world. So that way they will place themselves inside that virtual world. So these are kind of the basic steps, the minimum. This is what you have to do. Then we kind of get to the part where game design comes in if we're applying this to games. So attention to resource allocation. We need to make sure they are giving their attention to your game, to your virtual world. Whatever it may be, your tasks or combat, or I guess you could just say combat is a task. You need to be giving them tasks that require attention. And this also plays on the concept of flow. Make sure you're challenging them so that they have to focus in order to perform, in order to get whatever it is done that they need to be doing. And if you can get them to apply those resources to your virtual world instead of the physical world, they experience something called suspension of disbelief. Because when they first start, they don't believe this is a real world. Like, they are painfully aware that the physical world still exists. But this disbelief gets suspended once they remove their attention from the physical world and put it in the virtual world, which allows them to experience presence. So instead of believing I'm in a physical world and I'm playing in a virtual world, they just believe that they feel that they are in that virtual world. And whenever they stop attending to that outside world and they're only inside, they will start to perform better. They experience flow. They're applying attention, they're focused, they're doing the tasks that they need to do, and they will start performing at a higher level. And then this becomes a loop, because once they start performing at a higher level, they will focus even more. The better they do, they're going to focus more and more, and it's just going to continue in a cycle. The more attention they allocate inside the world, the less they think about the virtual world, more present they feel, better they perform, continue the cycle. So this is the immersion, presence, and performance model. You have to have hardware requirements, need to have good sensory fidelity, you have to have strong tasks that are requiring people to attend to whatever world you've put them in. So that's the first two. There's one more theory. I know theories are getting tiring. I promise this is the last one. The last one is flow, which we've talked about a lot, so I'm not going to spend a lot of time on. It's the optimal experience. You are in that flow channel. You've met all these requirements that are over here on the right, most notable of which is it has to be challenging but completable. You're appropriately challenging someone, which is causing them to attend, is to focus their attention on whatever they're doing, because they can't just breeze through it. But that it's also actually doable, so they're not getting so frustrated because they're failing. If you meet these 8 requirements, they will be present in your game. They will have so much attention taken up that they have forgotten about what's outside and they are only inside. And motivation plays a big role in this. If you can make them feel competent by giving them a challenge, but allowing them to complete that challenge, they will feel competent. And they're gonna be like, I want to continue doing this because it makes me feel good. It makes me feel like I know what I'm doing, which is an intrinsic motivation, which is what we want. We want people to be intrinsically motivated to play our games, because we know that intrinsic motivation is stronger and longer lasting than extrinsic motivation, which would be if we say, oh, if you play for an hour, we're going to give you this special item. That's an extrinsic motivator. And once they get that item, they don't care anymore. Or if you eventually stop giving them these external rewards, they don't care anymore. So if we can make them feel competent by putting them in this flow channel, and this makes them feel intrinsically motivated to come play your game, it's going to make them, when they're doing something else, be like, I want to go play. Like, I want to go play this game again. And this is where we want them. We want them to keep coming back. So the 3 theories: the grounded theory and immersion. You have to overcome barriers to reach individual states sequentially to become totally immersed. The immersion, presence, and performance model. You have same concept pretty much. You overcome these barriers to get to the end where they have to perform at a high level, which requires attention and causes them to be immersed, and then flow. We challenge them, we take up their attention, we give them the optimal experience, we intrinsically motivate them, and they feel like they're focused inside the world and they feel present there. And these are the concepts that I'm trying to reach. Like, how can we design in order to reach these concepts? Before we get to that last part of like, here's the list that I have, here's how I'm going to validate it, things like that, we need to know about VR itself. We've talked a lot about games. I've talked about Black Desert. We talked about Borderlands and Dark Souls. None of these are VR games, except for Borderlands now. Borderlands is now VR. But we're going to talk a little bit about the technology itself. So for those that don't know, the most common version of VR right now is HMDs, head-mounted displays. You put it over your face, and it covers your eyes completely. A lot of times you'll have headphones on, and then you have room-scale controllers. So this means when you move them in the physical world, they will move the same way inside the virtual world. And this is not just used for games. This is used for flight simulators. This has been used for surgical training. It's been used for education. There's a myriad of other ways that this has been used, and it will be used as the technology starts to develop, which is another reason why I think this is really important, because this concept will be applicable to all of those types. Immersing them in your software, even if it's not a video game, is still really important because it will mimic real world performance if they are totally immersed. But focusing on games can benefit from usability testing. They don't need it. As mentioned by Dr. Celia Hodent in her book, The Gamer's Brain, which if you haven't read it, I highly suggest it. I've been teaching my class with it. Very awesome. She talks a little bit about how usability testing is not required by anything. There's no rules out there saying you have to go through 5 usability tests before putting your game out, but it does help. We've seen time and time again, most of you guys are probably games UX researchers, and you've seen how many times it's improved a game when you do usability testing on it. And now we have VR games, which has much less background, much less of, oh, I already know this is going to be an issue because I've seen this before in this type of game. We don't really have that anymore. So there is a need for it. We need to develop that literature base so that people know, and just the knowledge base, so that people know, okay, we're going to start from this point instead of being regressed so far back because like we don't know the basics yet. It's really important that we get this knowledge base built up. And when we want to do usability testing, one way that we can do it that will be really good for game labs is a heuristic evaluation. This is quick, cheap, and effective. It's especially good for smaller game labs. The small game labs that can't spend $10,000 to bring in a bunch of researchers to come in and do research. Because this involves one person, one UX or usability expert coming in and saying, okay, I'm going to look at this list of these design concepts and I'm going to find all the violations of these concepts. And then I'm going to rate them on a scale of severity. 1 being this is cosmetic, no big deal, it can be played without it. And 5 being this is game breaking, we have to fix this now or people will not be able to play my game. And when people use domain-specific lists, so if you were using one specifically for video games, instead of just using Nielsen's 10, you will find a lot more problems specific to video games. It's more detailed. It gives you better guidelines, more specific guidelines, and more targeted guidelines for games, which has been shown in research to get the research. Researchers using them have found more problems, have done a better job at actually evaluating games. Nate, the book that was mentioned is The Gamer's Brain by Dr. Celia Hodent. Excellent book. But also the Games User Research book that you guys mentioned, I have that one too. It's also excellent. That is the Bible, that we call it the Bible at Wichita State. So, or our research Bible anyway. So this is what a heuristic evaluation is. And now I've repeated this a bunch of times, but now I'm going to tell you guys something that you haven't heard yet, which is a heuristic checklist. There's a difference between them. These are more effective than standard heuristic evaluations. And the way that they work is they take, instead of saying, okay, like looking at this one, visibility, show system status, tell what's happening. If I were to ask all of you guys what that means, you'd probably all have a slightly different version of it. So it makes it subjective for you. And when you're evaluating something, subjectivity, it's a touchy subject. So what we do is we turn it into a yes/no question, something very specific that you don't get to interpret. It means one thing. And showing this highlighted in blue, this is Nielsen's 10. Visibility of system status should always keep the users informed about what's going on through appropriate feedback. This is subjective. You have to make a decision on what this means to you and whether or not this game that you're evaluating meets that requirement. But we move over to what would be a checklist, and it says, okay, visibility of system status, same description, but we're going to break it into subcategories and say consistent notification display, and ask you the question, are notifications at the same time shown the same way every time? You just say yes they are or no they're not. This is not up for interpretation. It's a very specific question, and it's kind of takes out that subjectivity. It's still under the same concept, but it's also something you might not think about. Whenever I think of the system status, I don't think about how notifications are displayed. And this is why a checklist is more consistent, because it's not up for debate. It's not up for subjective evaluation. And it also gives you very detailed things that you should look at. So you can put a lot more on there. It can be evaluated more quickly, and it's a lot easier to spot these problems. And this is based on my research, this is going to be the best way to implement this for VR. So I have talked so much. You guys are probably getting sick of me. And you probably thought about something this whole time. Who cares? Why do we need this? We've been researching VR for 5 years now, and we're doing okay. Who cares? Especially about usability. How does usability matter to immersion? Have you ever played a game that was not usable, and were you immersed in it? Probably not. If you ever played a game that was just a terrible game, the second book was called Games User Research. It's a big blue book. But if you've ever played a game with glaring usability problems, you probably were not immersed in it. And so we need to lay the groundwork. If we have good usability, then this allows a game to be immersive. If it is broken as far as usability, if it's not usable, it cannot be immersive. This is the baseline. This is the expectation. It has to meet this. Then no matter how good your story is, no matter how good your characters are, if your game is not usable, it's not going to be immersive. So we need to make sure we're laying that ground, that base to build an immersive game off of. And then another important reason for this research is the adoption. VR has not been adopted yet. It's still in its baby stages. And if we're going to get it out there to the world, we need to make sure that it's usable. If people pick it up and they're like iffy about it, and then it turns out that it's not well designed, people are not going to adopt it. They're not going to pick it up, and it's not going to take off, which is going to hold back our ability to progress this type of technology. And so just a reminder on how I'm going to do this is I'm going to create a heuristic checklist for VR game design, making sure, trying to tick as many boxes as possible of, is this usable? Are we making sure that this is designed in a usable way so that people will potentially be able to get immersed in it? And I've reached the list generation stage, and where I stand right now is this current is what I'm going to talk about right now. And it looks like we do have a question.
Okay, our question is from Tony Mendrano. The question is, can we get links to some of these checklists? And I can provide those in chat if needed. Or the books, but the checklist is all you.
Right. I can provide links to there's some of them right here, some of the papers, and I can give you citations for all of the ones that I have. I currently have 14 lists, as is said right here. And if you're interested in it, I can totally give that to you. You can either email me. My email will be at the end of the talk, or however you prefer to receive them. I can definitely put them somewhere. And then my list will be available whenever I'm done with my dissertation, which will be a compilation of all of these lists and then more. So my current list has about 120 questions on it. The yes/no questions that we talked about a little bit earlier, and these are all derived from non-question heuristics. So there are currently no checklists that were useful for what I'm doing. So I had to take all of regular heuristics with just descriptions and make questions out of them, which is why it's so important that we validate this properly. It's been derived from 14 different lists, and later, once I get to the next step, I will actually go through usability terms usability studies, and find like what problems did they find, and would my checklist have caught them? If not, I will modify the list to make sure we're catching all of those problems. So how am I doing this? What's my method? 10 minutes, so I'm gonna try to get through all this in 5 minutes to leave time for extra questions. So the method that I'm gonna use for this is an 8-step method. I'm not gonna go through the whole thing. I'm going to kind of cover this on a very high level so I can focus on the validation part. So basically, up to this point, I have gathered a lot of different lists that are applicable, pulled the information that I felt could be applied to VR games, and put them in a consistent list. I have created descriptions, used the descriptions that they've given, and then developed questions for each one. So they're broken into subcategories, and each one has 1+ questions based on how many concepts it described within that heuristic. Then I went through the list and I made sure there's nothing that's really repeating. And if there is, I will either tweak them or combine them to make sure it's not asking redundant questions. And then I get to the validation stage, which is what I'm going to talk about now. So there's 3 ways that I'm going to validate this. One is a straight up heuristic evaluation. I am going to be using VR Play as my control list because it is currently the best and, in my opinion, most comprehensive VR heuristic list that is out there right now. So I will have 3 experts using my list and 3 experts using VR Play that will evaluate 3 games. And then I will compare how many problems they found, how many VR-specific games they found, or VR game-specific things they found, and how many severe problems they found. And see, is my list uncovering more than another list that is already applied to VR games? More specifically, a VR heuristic evaluation versus a VR heuristic checklist that's also involving all of these other lists. The second way is through expert judgment. I will have experts in VR games or usability, or rather VR games and usability and possibly heuristics, go through my list and answer a questionnaire for each one. And each of the things on the right side, each question will be rated on all of these things based on that expert's judgment. And then each one that is quantitatively below average, because some of these are just Likert scales, will be flagged for review. And then there will be qualitative comments afterward that will be used to adjust them, remove them, whatever it needs to be, based on the fact that they scored low on whatever things they scored low on. So that way I will get basically feedback from people who are experts in this field on whether or not these questions are useful, or they understand what they mean, or if they're even needed, and things like that. And then finally, a user test. I say a user test. User tests. I've actually done this with Skyrim in the past to test VR Play and suggest revisions to it. I will test 3 games, and I'll do user tests on 3 games and collect all of the problems that we uncover, all of the violations of usability that we find, and categorize them into my list and see, okay, is everything that we found, would it have been caught by the list that I'm providing? And if not, I will revise the list to make sure that it's comprehensive enough that it will cover all of the problems that I find throughout those 3 games. And it looks like we do have a question, but I just answered that question because it was how am I going to validate the questions? And this is how. Sorry I didn't see that before, but I'm glad I was able to answer it. And that's it. So I appreciate you guys for coming, and I'm happy to take any questions you may have. And thanks, Tony. I appreciate your compliment.
Yeah, we still have 5 minutes left. So if people have questions, you can post them in chat, or if you want to speak your question as well, you can raise your hand and we can allow you to ask your question verbally as well.
I appreciate all of the nice comments. Oh, so Tony, that's a great comment. I need VR and games experts and usability experts and all this. So if any of you are interested in being one of my experts for my validation, please email me. I would love that. So if you are interested in being involved with this, just shoot me an email. I'm also in the Discord, Daniel Smith in the GUR Discord. Please get in contact with me. That would be fantastic. See, this is the problem with all of my talks. They're just so good that there's no questions to be asked.
You
I've
hit
already
all the
answered everything.
points already, exactly. Okay, well, in that case, we can let you go, and we can start setting up the next presenter. Thank you so much,
Thank you.
Daniel, and thank you so much, Garrison, for moderating, and all of you for listening in.
We do have one question by Jasmine Granados, if you have time.
Oh, yeah, absolutely.
Jasmine Granados writes, are you testing this only on one VR system?
So I plan to use the Oculus Rift or the HTC Vive. Since the overarching concept is going to be the same across pretty much all of them, I probably will just use one. It's going to depend on availability. I know I have a setup at Wichita State using the HTC Vive, so that might be the one that I use. I don't think it's going to matter which VR system I use, but it will be using different games to make sure it's not just we want to have validation across several different software. This is focused mostly on software. There is some hardware stuff in there, but at the most, I would be able to test the Oculus Rift and the HTC Vive. So I will do the hardware stuff on those two, and the rest will be on the same one. And also, feel free to contact me if you just want to talk about VR. You guys listen to me talk for a really long time, and you can tell that I love it. So if you're just interested in talking about it, hit me up. I'll totally do that. I appreciate all the kind words.
All right, thank you so much.
Thank you.